Good morning. Right honorable, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends of the Victoria Forum, welcome in person in Victoria and welcome online to the third day of the 2024 Victoria Forum. Très honorables, distingués invités, collègues et chers amis du Forum, je pense qu'on peut vous appeler des amis du Forum, comme vous êtes ici de bon matin, après une longue journée et une longue soirée des plus agréables et enrichissantes hier soir. Merci d'être là. Ça témoigne non seulement de votre engagement à construire et bâtir la confiance pour un avenir partagé, mais ça témoigne aussi de la qualité de la conversation ou des conversations qui ont lieu à la fois en plénière, en breakout et peut-être surtout, direz-vous, pendant les pauses où vous pouvez justement faire votre réseautage et engager des personnes sur les sujets qui vous sont particulièrement intéressants. My name is Sébastien Beaulieu. I'm a career diplomat. I've served abroad, had the honor of being your ambassador abroad to a few countries, and I'm currently DG for emergency management, crisis response, and perhaps most importantly, preparedness for crises. I'm also adjunct at the University of Victoria's Gustafson School of Business as part of Canada's public diplomacy since 2016. I mention this because this partnership is an important one and one that has been emphasized by the Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And in their 2024 report, which we dubbed Fit for Purpose, the first recommendation to global affairs is to enhance the outreach to foster relationships between global affairs and Canadian international education institutions. So this partnership between global affairs and the University of Victoria and the Victoria Forum in particular is one important example. International affairs are part of the conversation throughout this forum, and this first panel is no exception. But before introducing the first panel, I'd like to proceed with a land acknowledgement, une reconnaissance territoriale pour qu'ensemble on reconnaisse aujourd'hui avec respect les peuples Lekwungen, Sanghees et Esquimalt et le territoire sur lequel l'université est située. Reconnaissant aussi les peuples Lekwungen et Wasanich, pour qui le lien historique avec la terre se poursuit à ce jour. So this morning's first panel is very international, both on form and substance, and you'll quickly understand why. And I'd like to now turn it over to Ryan Turnbull, MP for Whitby, Ontario, elected in 2019 and 2021, a social innovator, a change leader, and well-positioned as Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Innovation, Science, and Technology to introduce and to oversee the next panel. Over to you. Merci.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's a real honor to moderate this panel today, which is on innovative finance for regenerative reconstruction after conflict. I appreciate Sebastian's welcome and introduction, but we have quite the lineup of speakers today. I will say we have speakers that will be joining us from Kyiv, Michael Cholod, the founder of the Peace Coalition, from Regenerative, Ukraine, Yulia Darnitska, city councillor. We have a special message from the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Alexandra Matvichuk, the Center for Civil Liberties, which is a pre-recorded message, which I'll mention in just a moment. We also have speakers joining us, Peter Nicholas from Social Finance International, Jeffrey Goodell from University College London. We have the former U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues from Washington, D.C., David Sheffer. And we'll have on stage here in Victoria, live, we'll have Senator Ratna Ahmedvar, who's the chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology. We also have today with us the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. And last but not least, Louise Savelle, Director of Social Finance International. If you would come out and join me on stage here and take your seats, that would be great. Can we give them a round of applause? So the objectives of today's session, and I hope you've all had your coffee this morning, is to recognize, I think, first of all, that transformative change is needed, that reconstruction in Ukraine post-conflict is going to need potentially a creative solution and different model. We want to introduce to you, the audience today, and have some discussion among the panelists, an instrument for financing Ukraine's reconstruction that will be centered on community-driven social finance approaches and deploying philanthropic and private capital to build a thriving regenerative economy within a democratic society in Ukraine. We want to outline and focus and have discussion on the need for international collaboration around this approach. And please note that the session will support the work of a steering group that's comprised of representatives from the Peace Coalition Ukraine, Social Finance International, and the Victoria Forum, as well as other prospective partners. And we'll be inviting all of you to join us in those future conversations and work flowing out of today's discussion. I want to just a couple of housekeeping comments to anybody joining us online. There are people joining us remotely. Please feel free to pose questions by using the chat function online. We will be harvesting those from your comments, and there will be people at the microphones as we move throughout the agenda today. We'll be trying to make some time, if possible, for some questions from the audience in the room, but also from any questions that come in online. So I also want to offer just a couple of framing points on behalf of the Government of Canada, as I'm very privileged to serve as Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Our government has provided unwavering support to Ukraine, as I think many of you will be aware. That includes lethal and non-lethal military and humanitarian aid. We've, I think, demonstrated leadership from day one of the conflict, of Russia's illegal invasion. We've sanctioned Russian assets. We've amended the Special Economic Measures Act. And the latest announcement has been with G7 partners, where we've worked to offer Ukraine a $50 billion loan, which will be paid by the interest of Russian assets that are held within Euroclear. So this is all to help Ukraine in their continued fight. And I think we recognize that the path to recovery is going to be long, and much more will need to be done to rebuild Ukraine. And we encourage conversations, solutions-oriented conversations like the one we'll have today, and international collaboration among many partners. And I want you to know that the discussions we'll have today and ongoing out of today will have an impact, because they already have been having an impact on how the Government of Canada thinks and frames their work, but also what creative solutions we can consider for addressing the long-term needs of Ukraine's regenerative recovery. So with that said, let us now, without further ado, move into a pre-recorded message from Oleksandra Matvichuk, who's a Ukrainian human rights lawyer, whose organization, the Center for Civil Liberties, was awarded the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize. The topic of this video, which we'll play in just a moment, is why Ukraine's future is important to the world. Thank you.
My name is Oleksandra Matvichuk. I'm Ukrainian human rights lawyer, and I have been documenting war crimes in this war which Russia had started against Ukraine in 2014. Because this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014, when Ukraine obtained a chance for the quick democratic transition. We paid the highest price for this chance. More than hundreds of peaceful protesters were gunned down in the center of Kyiv. But when authoritarian regime collapsed and Ukraine got this possibility for democratic transition, in order to stop us on this way, Russia invaded. Russia occupied Crimea, part of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and 2 years ago extended this war to the large-scale invasion. Because Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom. And that is why, when we speak about Russia's war against Ukraine, this is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. We have been documenting now in Ukraine how Russian troops deliberately shelling residential buildings, schools, churches, museums and hospitals, attacking evacuation corridors, torturing people in infiltration camps, forcibly taking Ukrainian children to Russia, how they ban Ukrainian language and culture and destroy Ukrainian cultural heritage, how they robbing, raping, abducting and killing civilians in occupied territories, and how entire UN system of peace and security can't stop it. And all this hell, which we now face in Ukraine, it's a result of total impunity which Russia enjoyed for decades. Russian troops committing horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. If we want to stop and prevent wars in the future, we have to punish state and their leaders who start such wars in present. This is a common logic, but in the whole history of humankind, we have the only one such a precedent. And that is why we still look into the world through the lens of the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi war criminals were tried but only after Nazi regime had collapsed. But we live in a new century. Justice shouldn't be dependent on how and when this war will end. We cannot wait. We must establish a special tribunal now and hold Putin, Lukashenko, and top political leadership and high military command of Russian state accountable. We must break the circle of impunity. We must return people their name, because we are dealing with formation of the whole authoritarian bloc. Iran provided Russia with Iranian drones and ballistic rockets. North Korea sent to Russia more than 1 million artillery shells. China helped Russia to bypass sanctions and import the Western technologies critical to warfare. Syria voted for Russia in UN General Assembly. If authoritarian countries support each other, we, democracies, have to support each other even more stronger. Because democracies must win wars between authoritarianism and free world. There are a lot of things which have no limitation in national borders, like freedom is one of such things, as well as human solidarity. And we need your human solidarity, because only spread of freedom make our world safer.
Okay, so wow, what a video. I think the message, we can't wait, really stands out to me. Senator Amidvar, I'm going to pose the first question to you. You've been a champion in the Senate for much of the work related to the Special Economic Measures Act. And to date, allied countries have frozen significant amounts of Russian, both state and non-state or private assets of Russia, so both the oligarch assets and the Russian central bank assets and others. So there's frozen many billions of dollars worth of assets. And that response was fairly quick in terms of when the invasion happened. It happened pretty rapidly, I would say. And the UN has found or has passed resolutions that have called out the crime of aggression and clearly indicated that Russia has committed a crime of aggression, which means I think we can all agree that Russia needs to be held accountable for the damage that has been done to Ukraine. So why is it proving so difficult and hard from your perspective to apply those frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine's defense and its rebuilding efforts?
Thank you, Ryan, for that question. There's no simple answer to it, but let me put it in layman's terms. It's hard to take someone else's money away legally, especially when the money is the money belonging to a state, in this case, Russia. And what we really require is will, in this case, political will, to go after the big prize. I was here on Sunday as Nigan Sinclair talked about trust, which is the theme of this conference. And he put out that trust is linked to accountability, which is linked to justice. And that linkage applies, I believe, so very firmly to this context with the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And yet we find it really hard to hold Russia accountable. The ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Putin, but there's not a chance that Putin is ever going to stand trial, and resolutions have been passed. Canada, as you mentioned, has taken the step of amending its sanctions legislation to seize and repurpose assets of individuals and state entities. But after doing that in 2021, I think, and I should give a lot of credit here to the World Refugee Migration Council. Lloyd is the president and the founder. All these proposals that I have championed are really the proposals that come from the World Refugee and Migration Council, and I've been sort of their parliamentary voice. But I think we should note that going after state assets is a whole different hill to climb, and we have found a way to be able to seize state assets through legal means. Canada already has the capacity to use countermeasures which are within the context of international law, but I believe use of countermeasures is further strengthened by the creation of domestic legislation, which again is before the Senate, to allow Canada to legally seize the state assets of Russia. The US, by the way, already passed such a law, the REPO Act, which is in action, and I'm certainly hoping Canada will follow suit. To the proposal to provide Ukraine with a $50 billion loan securitized against future profits of the $350 billion that are held in Euroclear, I think it is a proposal that speaks to a core aspiration of Canada, which is solidarity. Let's act in solidarity with our G7 partners. But I think we should also remember that acting in solidarity with G7 partners, particularly those in Europe, makes us, there's history at play. There's dependency on oil in the EU. There's very complicated history post First and Second World War. Canada does not have that. So I believe Canada can and must be more courageous and go after state assets. Not that there is a heck of a lot of Russian state assets in Canada, not at all. But it is, as a middle power, perhaps our role to create the legal precedents so that others can follow, as they did previously. So again, threading the needle back to trust, accountability, and justice. Here is a clear example of how Canada can play a role.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for all your commitment. I've had the honor of working with you in our parliament, and I can say honestly that you're a fantastic champion for a whole range of causes, and this is one of them that you've been steadfast on. Mr. Axworthy, speaking of justice, solidarity, Canada's ambitions and Canada's role internationally, certainly your political life, I think, and post-political life has always been championing causes that pursue justice nationally and internationally. And I know as former Minister of Foreign Affairs, some of your work has often been cited, in particular the Global Mine Ban Treaty, which is often cited as something, as an exemplary case of Canada's leadership around the world, and how we can actually influence international collaborations. Now, from your perspective, what does your experience tell you about why this acting on Russian assets in terms of repurposing them for the purposes of aiding Ukraine in both its defense but also its rebuilding efforts? Why is it politically wrought and even operationally wrought with challenges from your perspective? Because you have a lot of experience that I'm sure you can share, what you think might be holding us back internationally.
Let me begin, if I might, first paying my compliments to the Senator, just to share with the audience. Senator Almodovar is retiring from the Senate, I think, in November. And I have to say, when she talks about political agency with a moral purpose, I think that she has exemplified that in her years. And I think we really, as a country, owe a lot to her in terms of leadership on a range of issues. But she's been a member of our council and has been the kind of sharp end of the spear in Parliament on things like refugee detention, the proper way in which we manage the rights of refugees, all issues which have been kind of pushed to the sideline. But which takes me to a point. I think that any foreign policy initiative venture has to have its roots in the kind of both political culture and the restraints that are being faced externally. And we're in a tough time right now. I think we've, in some ways, and I'll speak about this later on a panel with Joe Clark, we're going to talk a little bit more about the politics in Canada. And I should also say, if I might be so bold, I have a book coming out in October where I'm going to be addressing these issues in hopefully in a more fulsome way than I have now. But we hit sort of a wall. I think that there was a kind of a root set of what we thought were Canadian values, and that no longer exist, or they're muted. I wouldn't say they exist. They've just been partly offset by a politics of, I guess, of what I call personality, as opposed to a politics of purpose or principle, and there's reasons for that. But I think also that the particular question of using the frozen assets of the Russian sovereign state and the oligarchs that go with it really challenged a lot of the basic underlying precepts that were built into the kind of neoliberal version of the world that occupied us for so long. I think we're finally shedding our skin on that particular phobia, but I think that right now the real problem was that you don't touch these things. And I think we had a group of people in Ottawa and in Washington, and particularly in Brussels and Berlin, which really had this notion that this was a market issue, and to intrude politics into it was something that had to be pushed back. And we've also had some bad legal decisions along the way. Senator, I think you'd agree, for example, that the International Court of Justice, when it was asked to rule on the issue of genocide, very substantially reduced the concept. They didn't talk about it really as a way of exterminating people. It was, you had to do some kind of physical attack on it. And therefore, some of the legal underpinnings haven't been there. And I think we've fought for it. Let me just give a moment of history that I think where I first became sort of intrigued about the use of repurposing assets was when our council was doing really a reconnaissance mission in Africa as to what the situation of refugees were and how we were doing the resettlement or not doing it. And one of the things that really came through very vividly and disturbingly is that so much of what we have been providing in the way of international development aid never reaches the actual communities. It's all siphoned off by a whole series of intermediates. But the real question was that so much of the cause of refugees is not because they're nasty or they're rapists or they're criminals, it's because other people have created a conflict that forces them out. I mean, the whole notion that civilians have been on the periphery and the core interests, which really were making decisions for the world, were simply treating refugees as really as a secondary, tertiary, maybe. And one of the ways to come to it is what the senator mentioned. I know the word of accountability. The use of there's an old saying I remember in my taking my graduate courses. There was a wonderful book by a political scientist named Ronald Dahl called "Who Governs," and I think you would know the book. And the basic thing is follow the money, and that you want to know where the power is, follow the money. And therefore, one of the most critical issues that we need to address in terms of helping to recast our institutions and our policies is to come to the reality that so much of that money is really beyond sort of public responsibility and accountability. And we thought at the time that what we should do is initiate a repurposing of frozen assets of those warlords, autocrats, militia, external genocidaires, and say, we're going to tap into the banks in Monaco and other places, because you're going to have to help pay for the damage and the destruction that you created for refugees, and it's part of it. So that was the kernel of the idea. And we began to put some papers out, and when the senator joined our council, it was almost, I think, coterminous with the invasion of Ukraine. And that's when we had some serious discussion about how we could take that basic concept that we'd written. It was in a report we published in 2019, and translate it into something that would be targeted at Ukraine. And that's where I think the key issue became, because the moral side of it was clear and without dispute. That if you are creating a major transgression against people, you pay for it, and you're held accountable for it. The problem is, and I think the senator again pointed out, in the meantime, there have been all kinds of intricacies introduced into the international banking system, and the mindset of the people who run it is to say, don't touch this money because there's a quid pro quo. They may come after us. And it's a world unto its own. It's not subject to the normal kind of political pressures. And I think that's one reason why it's been so difficult to try to get full endorsement of the idea, particularly out of the European countries.
I know in having these conversations for some time, the term sovereign immunity comes up quite often, and legal experts have often cited that as reasons why you can't touch state assets, which I know has been part of the debate that we've been trying to overcome. And essentially, I think your points are well taken, that the moral ground of having to serve justice at an international level when there's been a clear violation of international law takes precedence over sovereign immunity. And yes, so I really appreciate your comments. I want to also give an opportunity to former ambassador to the United States for war crimes issues, David Sheffer, who's joining us online, to comment on this. And I know in cases where governments lack the funds or means to support humanitarian efforts, Mr. Sheffer has talked about rebuilding Ukraine and engaging the private sector and helping them get involved. And this may be a way to overcome some of the obstacles that governments face when trying to do these things. So, Mr. Sheffer, I know you're joining us online from Washington, but you proposed a social bond concept which would be financed by philanthropy and impact investors and repaid by the interest accruing from seized Russian assets as a means of holding Russia accountable. And obviously, speed is of the essence with regard to recovery. Could you speak to the concept that you proposed and which started quite a number of conversations in Canada here with the Peace Coalition a while back? Mr. Sheffer, can I go to you?
Well, thank you so much. And I'm so honored to be addressing all of you today, particularly Senator Omid Devar and, of course, my colleague in the halls of justice, Lloyd Axworthy, who I worked with in the late 1990s as we were building the International Criminal Court. I'll just briefly say that this really started there with the ICC, this concept of the social bond in my thinking about 7 years ago. First, I want to say to our Ukrainian friends, congratulations. Your parliament just approved Ukraine to enter the ICC as the 125th nation. Canada's been there for a long time. I would like to see the United States there tomorrow, if possible. But I think it's to the credit of Ukraine that they are now going to be part of the International Criminal Court. I'll just briefly say, and then I'll jump to Ukraine itself, that the germ of this idea was my concern, having worked with the Secretary General at the UN for 6 years on financing and supporting the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, that we had to find a different way to finance ventures of this character. Instead of always going cup in hand to governments, including Canada, year after year after year, to find contributions for international criminal tribunals. And it occurred to me that the social bond, which was very nascent at that point, could be an answer to it. So I worked with a couple of major law firms, et cetera, to try to develop this, as well as investment banks, including Goldman Sachs, to develop the proposal that would be directed actually towards paying the annual budgets of the international criminal tribunals, including the International Criminal Court, including the Trust Fund for Victims. How could we better finance these institutions using the private sector and not necessarily the public sector at all times to do so? And we developed very precise proposals, which I brought to the ICC, I brought to the Trust Fund for Victims, et cetera. And those proposals still stand. I think for those institutions, it was a bridge too far to jump from public financing to private financing. They just weren't there yet. But for me, it was vital because I had spent 6 years traveling the world to raise money, $30 million a year for the Cambodia Tribunal. And there had to be a better way. There just has to be a better way. Now, when we take that proposal, which is still standing, but apply it to Ukraine, it's a little bit different. And the report that we issued, that I co-authored along with Jeff Goodell and others, I know Jeff is going to be speaking, and put out by the World Refugee and Migration Council, looks at the social bond from a slightly different perspective of how it is actually financed, where the income comes from, and what its purpose is, which is to get money as quickly as possible into Ukraine for reconstruction purposes. At that time, we weren't thinking about military hardware for Ukraine when we were doing this 2 years ago. We were thinking of the economic reconstruction issues. And I think we put forward a very, very plausible proposal in the council report that I hope is made available to everyone there, or at least the link to it, because it really does provide a means of tapping the private sector in order to essentially finance a public purpose, which in this case is the reconstruction of Ukraine. The advantage for Ukraine in this entire matter is that you've got a little bit of leverage on Russia here. Obviously, there's the frozen asset of frozen assets of Russia. They're not necessarily seized yet, but the frozen assets of Russia that the senator was speaking about. And that can be used as a basis of collateral. But we also put forward the notion that if we were to lift the sanctions against Russia and instead apply new tariffs to all trade with Russia, that tariff income would be able to finance the social bonds. And of course, you have what I call social investors sitting there wanting ultimately to get their principal back, but periodically to get an interest payment on their bonds. You need to have some income to do that. You're going to put all this money very quickly into reconstruction, but then ultimately the bond has to be paid off. The kicker to all of this, which I found with the courts as well, is that if you can persuade the major AAA countries out there, and Canada, I think as I recall, is AAA, if not, it's top of the AA category. I can't quite remember where Canada is. The United States now is unfortunately AA plus. Then those countries, if they are guaranteeing those social bonds as a final last gaps, solution to it, if everything else fails, the social investors will come. They'll buy the social bonds. You'll get your money within 24 hours. I mean, Goldman Sachs works this out. It'll be 24 hours and the money on the social bond will be raised. And so we wanted to sort of apply that in a step-by-step way. Obviously, here you have the advantage of the Russian assets as collateral, and then you have the tariffs. That would be the normal income coming in, and the interest on the frozen assets if it's not entirely taken up by the other schemes that have come forward since then. And then ultimately, if 25 years from now, there's still failure on the bond somehow, you have the ultimate guarantee of the governments. But the point of all of this is an infusion of an enormous amount of money from the private sector into the reconstruction of Ukraine. And it's even more important now because the public money is going still towards purchase of armaments, which are critical for the war. That's where the public money in large part is going towards, as opposed to reconstruction. So that elevates the importance of the social bond. Now, I want to close with this one point, and I can elaborate on it in questions if you wish, which is I think this is an issue if there are to be negotiations ultimately between Russia and Ukraine. The social bond is an attractive leverage point because instead of insisting that Russia pay in cash reparations, which they're not going to want to do, this is a vehicle by which you say to them, well, wait a minute, we want you to concede that we're going to put tariffs on trade to Russia and from Russia, and we've got some frozen assets that we're going to use the interest income off of to pay for these social bonds from our private sector, but we want you to stand down. Do not obstruct this. Do you agree? Because we're not asking for real money from your coffers. We're asking for what's already out there and what's in, and we're not literally using the frozen assets. We're using it as collateral. So I do think it's an issue that ultimately could be on the table in the negotiations if and when there are negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mr. Shepard. It's great always to listen to you because I think both your experience internationally, I think you're identifying a sort of an elegant, potentially, solution that I know there's many variants of because there's discussions happening that have been ongoing for quite some time about variations of that concept. And I want to go to Jeffrey Goodell now, who's at University College London, but has considerable experience in this area in developing financial products in his past career, and I think is a great advisor on this. And he's looked at variations of the social bond concept that Ambassador Sheffer has spoken of. And so, I think, Mr. Goodell, if I could ask you to maybe cover how you think that we could deploy an instrument like this and describe, I know that in our previous conversations we've talked about this concept of time shifting a future liability that Russia owes. And it's trying to get, as Ambassador Sheffer said, money to Ukraine as quickly as possible, knowing that there are multiple ways to pay a return to a number of different investors in the future. So maybe you could speak to how collateralization, I mean, I know there's a number of variants that you and I have discussed in the past with other colleagues, but maybe you could cover a short overview of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. I think that what the ambassador said is really the touchstone of this. We looked at many different possible proposals or possible solutions in this space, and we found that many of them were lacking. In particular, there were concerns about seizing the Russian assets because and just liquidating them, because we can't just liquidate them and sell them at a fire sale and expect to get something close to what we need. Similarly, this concern that we can't just go to Russia and expect that they're going to agree to a kind of regime like the oil for food program in Iraq, and our experience there. It's just a foundationally different scenario that we have here, and that of course led us to tariffs. And really, what the idea here is that we want to time shift the payments from these investors in the bond, right, which we know have to come from the public, that have to come from the private sector. We know this. Basically by process of elimination, in terms of where the money is and and what we need to provide to them. We need to time shift those payments to Ukraine, because we know that there will be trade with the Russian Federation and its and other parties in the future. We just need to find a way to direct some of the profits and the proceeds from these business transactions in the future into the present, where it is needed for rebuilding Ukraine today. And this basically would take place by moving the claims into a special purpose vehicle, which may or may not be collateralized by Russian assets that had been frozen. But ultimately, the idea would be that investors in this social bond would basically invest in an investment fund, and the proceeds from and what is raised in this fund would be directed into a reconstruction fund that would be used to pay off claimants now or in the present, while in the future, in the fullness of time, when tariff revenues come in from trade with the Russian Federation and others, ultimately, the revenues that come from those tariffs would be used to pay back the investors. Now, this is really important because there are some unanswered questions about the details of what the size of this trade is going to be, whether it would need some degree of government subsidy, for example, into the payback to investors in the future in order to top it up, how much subsidy would be needed to encourage this kind of trade. But these decisions could be taken in the future. They don't need to be taken today in the form of a bond that is issued to that would ultimately be paid by taxpayers now. The decision for whether this would need subsidy from governments or not would be taken in the future. And ultimately, we're relying upon this idea that we know that trade is going to take place. It's only a matter of how much and when. And the investors into this would know that this is going to be coming from a realistic source of revenue and not necessarily the need to chase down Russia for reparations, or even worse, require the Ukrainian government to try to chase down Russia for or other parties for proceeds, as if it would look like the kind of bond in which they would be liable. We can't do that either. We need to make the liability of this ultimately be within the nations that are orchestrating the issuance of this bond, not Ukraine. And ultimately, it would need to be it would need to take the form of something that has revenues that we tangibly believe are going to take place in the future. And we know that there are tremendous agricultural and mineral resources in Russia, if not other resources as well. And we would expect that these revenues would come, and this financial instrument would just be a way to time shift those proceeds from the future into the present when they're needed to start the rebuilding process.
Thank you for that. And I know it's sort of a complex concept, isn't it, to think through how we do this potentially at an international level. But it seems as though there is specific constraints that an instrument like this or some variation of it may help us overcome some of those constraints. So thank you for that overview. It's really great to have such esteemed colleagues here to sort of give us their multiple perspectives. I want to move into a bit more of a discussion with some of our speakers that are joining us from Ukraine in talking about community rebuilding in Ukraine. Because of course there is, I don't know what the inventory of damage is at this point in terms of what the total cost and damage is, but maybe I could ask Yulia Darnitska, who's joining us from Ukraine online, if she could speak to maybe how we prioritize where to start rebuilding when the time comes.
My name is Yulia. I'm from Chernihiv City Council, and I'm serving as a city councilor from 2020. And of course, the most difficult times for our city started in 2022 because we are situated in 70 kilometers from the border with Russia in the north of Ukraine, and we were one of the first who met the enemy in 2022. For 40 days, they bombed our city, and they surrounded our city. And of course, some of the districts were fully destroyed, and some of the schools were fully destroyed, and others were damaged. So we started renovation process in April 2022, when Russians left our region, as Kyiv region as well. And from that time, we're in the process of early recovery. We opened schools for children in September 2022. We renovated those schools that were possible. And of course, it helped to our city a lot because children went to the schools, of course, with the bomb shelters, because they need to go to the bomb shelter every time when it's a red siren. So that schools that opened their doors in September. And city started to live again because parents went to their job, and the city start to recover. And we have problem with our location because we cannot start reconstruction, like full reconstruction process, because it's risky area. Still, we have this border nearby, so we're in the process of early recovery, windows, roofs, and it's risk for us to start building of new houses for people, even some big infrastructure objects, because we understand that in 1 minute it can be destroyed. We work a lot with international organizations in humanitarian sphere. Of course, now, thanks for support, we're not really so in need as south and east of Ukraine, where is front line, but we want to support our people, and we're trying to give them all support as a city council. Of course, we want give water for them, how it's possible, because our water system suffered from bombing in 2022, and still it's in the process of recovery. So we're working a lot, but mostly support for this reconstruction process goes from international partners. We understand that government cannot support everything now, because all resources goes to army now, and some not big but very important projects they support, but like it's a small amount. And of course we don't have a local budget for a reconstruction process. It's because of course, like a lot of businesses evacuated, relocated their business to more safety regions. People, like around 15% of people left the city, and like our economy not so good now. So city budgets only goes to some very, very important infrastructure objects, and just regular life of the city.
Julia,
So
can I
yeah.
just, sorry to, I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm just, so I'm gonna sort of, what I've heard from you, which I think is really important for us to know in this room, is that Ukraine's needs nationally tend to be focused on aiding the military to continue to fight the war and defend their territorial integrity, but also potentially their operational needs. I've heard you mention that there's infrastructure that's been damaged, and maybe, and I'm asking you this question, is there, like, can we empower local communities, and do they have the capacity, and maybe I'll ask you to comment on this, is there capacity on the ground to really start thinking, re-envisioning and rebuilding efforts now, or do we need to sort of wait and continue to maybe develop that capacity that's needed? And could, you know, these financial instruments that we're discussing today, could they really help in that process of empowering local municipalities in Ukraine to re-envision their future and start the rebuilding when the time comes? So I want to ask you, and then go to Michael Chalode, who's the founder of the Peace Coalition as well. So Yulia, can you comment on that, maybe in a short comment, and then we'll go to Michael as well?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a fan of idea of decentralization and decentralized support. So for example, our city has capacity to rebuild, and we have teams, we have local NGOs, very successful and very like they have this resource of people, but we don't have a lot of money resource. So yeah, it depends, of course, on situation, because every community has its own situation and its own capacity. But our city is 250,000 people, of course, so we can start this process of renovation. But there are communities of 1,000 people or like smaller. And in that situation, like region can support this small community. But if we speak about centralized support, it's like a big bureaucracy machine as it works slow, and when this support comes to community, it's time, it's resources, and for us, I think it's more effective way to support it's local.
Okay, thank you. And maybe I'll go, that's a good place to go to Michael Chalode, who's Ukrainian Canadian that moved to Kyiv in the middle of the war to found the Peace Coalition, which is one of the partners for the ongoing work here. And Michael, can you speak to you know, the need for an outcome-based or social bond type financing tool, and how that may help empower local governments in Ukraine?
Sure. Thanks, Ryan, and thanks everybody for giving me the chance to speak here. So One of the things that basically everything that Yulia has said is right. The reconstruction of the country, most people would think that that would be the responsibility of the country, of the central government, right? You're rebuilding Ukraine, it's the Ukrainian government. It's not, right? The government itself is focused on winning the war. And so the actual responsibility for the rebuilding of communities like Chernihiv and, the villages that surround it fall to the local community. And this is one of the problems. I mean, we've got, as Yulia mentioned, Chernihiv was one of the first cities to kind of face the Russian onslaught in April of last year. And a lot of the cities around Kyiv, Irpin, Borodyanka, Gostomel, Bucha, some of the ones that we've all heard of, they were, kind of bases for Russian occupation in March of 2023, and they're still not rebuilt. And there's people still living in temporary shelters and garden sheds and things, and it is literally because they do not have the capacity to apply for funding. And so one of the things that I think that is something that really excites me, and I think is a real opportunity for the impact community, is that generally speaking, what you're looking for as an impact investor is transparency, is community engagement, is results-based financing, outcomes-based financing, this type of thing, right? Responsible capital. And that is exactly what is necessary and is exactly the opportunity in Ukraine. So, I'll just give you a quick example. We went out to a set of apartment buildings in Gostomel that were, you'll see them, these buildings, these big, they call them Khrushchevskis, these big buildings where a bomb went right down the middle. And this one was one of the famous ones because there's a Banksy artwork in the wall on the inside. And there's still, this used to house 300 people, 20, 30 families. Now there's still 4 families living in this building. It has been 2.5 years. They have no power, they have no water, they have no gas, but they're still living there because they have nowhere else to live. And they are on their own trying to put together, hire engineers, hire architects, right? And fill out an application for the Danish money. And then they have to do the same thing for German money. And then they have to do the same thing for Canadian money and the same thing for USAID and all of these other different organizations. Whereas all of these organizations, broadly speaking, apply impact-based credentials to their funding requirements. And so, I was in Berlin at the Ukraine Recovery Conference, and a lot of these foreign investment representatives that were there were bemoaning the fact that they had money, but they had not a lack of investable projects, which speaks to the on-the-ground reality. And so, what needs to happen is the impact community can unite around a set of principles where if you meet these guidelines, if you have a project, if you have the support of the community, if you have a plan for the future that everybody loves and votes on, then why would that not be fundable by Global Affairs, USAID, right? The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, all of these folks. So I think the real opportunity in Ukraine is to take impact investing principles, and it's not just Ukraine. Gaza is going to need to be rebuilt. Syria still needs to be rebuilt. Yemen, Myanmar, all of these countries. If the impact community can stand up and say, look, we have the principles that all of these international financial institutions and development finance groups apply, they just do it differently. The Danish want bike lanes, right? There's all these different subtle requirements, but at the end of the day, impact says, transparency, equality, sustainability, governance, capacity at the local level. If we can build one model in this country and then just have everybody say, yep, that checks my box, then we go ahead.
That's great, Michael. Thank you for that. And perfect segue to our next speaker, which is Louise Savelle and Peter Nicholas, who's joining us. So Louise, we have here in person, which is fantastic. And they're from Social Finance International. And they piloted, as many of you probably know, the first social impact bonds in the world, I believe. So they have quite the claim to fame around social impact bonds and quite the experience in dealing with and developing models for outcomes finance, community-based outcomes finance. So Louise, I'll hand it over to you and Peter to do a short presentation here with some slides, as I understand.
Thank you so much. Could I ask for the slides to be put up? So as you said, Ryan, and as Michael, Julia, and others have said, I'm pivoting a little bit to away from the really important question of where does the money come from, and onto the question of, well, how do you ensure that it's well spent once it's available? And specifically picking up on this question of housing reconstruction or infrastructure reconstruction that Julia and Michael just spoke so compellingly to the need for, we think that this is a really crucial first step. We know from other post-conflict contexts that housing reconstruction plays a really important role in rebuilding the social fabric of communities that are recovering from conflict. We also know those needs are likely to be very high, and that the communities that are coming together are going to have a range of different experiences. So some of those people coming into new communities or rebuilt housing will be coming from the local area. Others will have been displaced from areas of the country that are no longer safe to live in, and others might be coming back from international contexts where they've been living as refugees. Layer over that the psychological and physical needs of a conflict-afflicted population, and you see that there are very high needs to accommodate and real thought that is needed to go into how the reconstruction process is designed and delivered. Now, housing, in addition to creating the stability for communities to be built and to rebuild their lives and their livelihoods, can also help promote economic recovery. It can create jobs. It can support local supply chains. It can push money into local economies that maybe have been struggling. So we think it's a really important first step. However, we also know that a rapid influx of funds can create real challenges in any context. The needs, as we've heard today, are significant. The funding, even at scale, is likely to be insufficient to fully meet those needs, putting real pressure on the efficiency and effectiveness of how those funds are used. And then you can layer over that in a post-conflict context or a mid-conflict context, as we currently are, limitations to state capacity, potentially ongoing insecurity, and then a huge amount of pressure, both from local stakeholders and potentially international stakeholders, to see results very quickly and money spent very fast. And that can lead to corruption, or at least poor procurement decisions around how housing is built and developed. And we've seen in other post-conflict contexts the results of that, which can be very low quality housing, thrown up very quickly in places or in structures that communities don't want, and ultimately that communities don't use beyond the very initial period once they have some choice. So we think that those are some of the risks of this money starting to flow at scale, but there is really an exciting opportunity as well. So post-conflict reconstruction offers significant opportunities to build back better. And what we mean by that is really taking the opportunity to use the funds that are available to implement 21st century sustainable housing construction techniques, to really think about and plan for the needs of the communities that are going to be living there, veterans and their families. What will they need? Where will they work? Where will their children go to school? How will they access health services? And to think about not just providing those services, but also how they will get to those services, the transport links that are needed to really create a community rather than just units of housing. Now, As I mentioned before, I think there is likely to be a real pressure at some point when money flows at scale, irrespective of where those funds come from, to spend that money very quickly. And in that context, community engagement and community and needs can very easily get sidelined. So we've been doing some thinking with Stephen at the Victoria Forum and Michael at the Peace Coalition and others to think about, well, how can what we know about outcomes funding and outcomes finance in other contexts potentially support community engagement and community accountability in post-conflict reconstruction? And our instinct is that the amounts of money are likely to be too big in terms of the core spending for outcomes finance to play a significant role. So we see a real role for what you might call conventional infrastructure finance, probably a mix of commercial debt that's repayable through rentals or sales of the properties that are built, and layered over that some infrastructure grants that are payable probably against construction milestones. So far, so normal. But we think there is a real potential to put private developer profits at risk on the basis of their accountability to community needs. What do we mean by this? Our instinct is this would vary depending on the phase that the project is at, but that there are three really critical points of engagement where accountability is really important. The first is in the planning and design of what's done to ensure incentives are in place to really engage with communities, to map their needs, understand their aspirations, and to really ensure that they're consulted in the design of what is being proposed. The second then, as I mentioned before, is around construction, putting in metrics around those 21st century environmental standards that not only will help climate, but also potentially alleviate future fuel poverty and other considerations. And potentially also some local regeneration, economic regeneration metrics, something around how much of the local, of the construction workforce is coming from the local population, etc., to ensure that the funds, at least some of them, are staying within the local communities. And then the third, and this is potentially the most radical bit, because private developers are not used to being held accountable on this basis, is holding some back for whether communities are actually happy about what's being built, whether they're satisfied with it, whether it's damp in 18 months and they're hating living there, or whether actually there's well-lit streets, there's accessible schools, there's places for their children to play, etc., and that they're happy with the spaces that have been created. So I'm not going to talk in huge detail. Others, Ryan, you mentioned that there is a plan to put in place a working group process to really push this work forwards following the forum this week. But I think really there are two real prizes here. One, as Michael and Julia mentioned, is there are some opportunities in the short term to pilot this approach and to demonstrate proof from principle for how this might work before the big reconstruction funds start to flow. And the reason that's important from our point of view is that the real win here, I think, is to influence big actors like the World Bank, who hold the Ukrainian Reconstruction and Development Fund, and will be a conduit for a huge amount of the international funding that flows for reconstruction, to influence them in terms of the principles that they are requiring when they're flowing the money through at scale, to really ensure that community accountability is at the heart of how the funding is spent.
Great overview, and thank you for that. I think it might be a good moment here to potentially go to the audience. So see if anybody has any questions. There's microphones at the side in the aisle. And if there's any questions that have come in online, I know that we'll also maybe take one from there. So I see someone getting up to the microphone here. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Naomi. I'm not used to talking in big audiences like this, but I did want to say that this morning and yesterday has filled me with both great inspiration and hope, as well as a profound disappointment. And I believe that these spaces are where civil society and the private and public sectors have the opportunity to discuss solutions to the world's most pressing issues, the sticky and complex ones, with some bravery. So outside of Parliament and where we have these hats that we have to wear, that we can talk about really what it means to move forward. I did want to acknowledge Honorable Axelworth. It's a pleasure to be in the company of one of the architects of the responsibility to protect doctrine. And I'm really inspired by how you have all rallied around Ukraine and supported them in this devastating conflict. I did want to thank Michael because he did mention Gaza. And I had the great privilege of living in Palestine for 7 years as a fundraiser. So I am very, very keenly aware of these regulations by world governments and INGOs. So I just, based on reports that have come out of the United Nations Economic Social Commission for Western Asia in 2017, based on the ICJ ruling this year, this was on the war crimes committed in Gaza. I just wondered when and how Canada can use these innovative approaches with bravery and not selective applicability, but global applicability in these tricky situations and complex conflicts. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I think the question is about the applicability of a model like this to other post-conflict areas in the world, and I think we all anticipate that the development of this work could lead to applications in other places, and I think it's perhaps Louise, you want to speak to that, and Senator Ahmedvar, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, our instinct is that these approaches, both approaches actually, both in terms of thinking about mechanisms to front load donor or other sources of funding, and also approaches to really drive community accountability for what is then built, the society, the communities that are then rebuilt, are really deeply applicable to a lot of post-conflict contexts. And, I think there is a huge prize here in terms of, to some extent, using the opportunities around the reconstruction of Ukraine to really just demonstrate what that might look like and create a future.
Thanks. Senator Ahmedvar, do you want to weigh in on this?
Thank you, Ryan. I should clarify that Canadian legislation around the seizure of assets is deliberately jurisdiction agnostic. We do not mention the word Russia. We do not mention Ukraine. This is our first effort. Proof of concept can be applied and applied in other circumstances as well.
Thank you. Mr. Axworthy, over to you.
I'd just like to offer a little bit of a counterpoint. I think the question is very well put. What about the other hotspots and what's going on? However, if Putin gets away with what he's doing in Ukraine, forget all the other models, all the other creations, it will be a substantial sort of unraveling of any kind of international consensus. And I think there's a forum, a public forum, which is hopefully designed to put forward propositions and priorities to consider. I think we have to get our act together in this country. I think that we are doing the right things, we're making the right noises, but we're kind of operating at mid-speed. And I really think that the time has come to realize that I guess the Ukrainians are taking the bold move as they did moving into Russia. But with another winter coming, with their power systems totally being decimated, we're not talking about reconstruction. We're talking about some form of winning and not being overturned and taken over by this thug. And I think that that's something that Canadians better start paying a little bit more attention to. Because right now, we're having a kind of election fever going on, which means we're going to argue about, sort of pretty silly things, actually, about who wears a crazy hat. Politics, as they always say, when an election comes, it's like a fire in a restaurant. It's all grease and smoke. The reality is, I think that we're facing an urgent crisis. And the thing I used to ask myself in politics is when and how. And I think right now the when is now. And the how is to start putting our diplomatic efforts to rounding up support, discussion. We have a UN session coming up. We're going to chair the G7 in the new year. Now's the time to start putting our diplomatic sort of Amway team out there, as we did in the landmines campaign. We didn't wait around, for kind of Gaston to say it's okay. We went ahead and said to the world, we have to sign a treaty. You come to Canada, and we'll make it happen. I think the same kind of mobilization is required. And I think that would be the best model. That would be the best demonstration if you actually showed that you can really mount that kind of support against that kind of sort of authoritarian aggression.
Great, thank you, Lloyd. I knew we could count on you to play the trumpet on Canada leading these efforts, and I know that we've been pushing as a government. I have a timeline of all of it's the international collaboration that seems so key, that Canada can't act on its own. Do you have any insight on how we get all of the other countries to, who rightfully have some concerns and are reticent at times? So, what is the secret? Is there a secret sauce to that you can give to us?
Yeah, hard work, some guts, and some ambition, and some incentive. Canadian diplomacy has a very long, good track record when it has something active to do. Right now, we're dealing in transactions primarily, and we're good at it, and we go to all the right meetings, we make the right noises, but in terms of leadership, it's not there. It's not there with anybody, for that matter, and I think that what we need, we could help create the sort of sense of urgency. And as I said, we have a United Nations General Assembly meeting coming up in 3 or 4 weeks. Canada should be taking a stand at that and saying, okay, all you states who are, the Modis of the world and the Bulls, the others who are all kind of tippy-toeing, saying, look at big issues are at stake. And Ukraine, how much longer can it last with the kind of attrition warfare that the Russians are doing? And that, to me, is that we have a responsibility to take on that kind of support right now.
Thank you. Great. And I see another person at the microphone, so please go ahead.
Thanks so much. George Benson from the Zero Emissions Innovation Center. I have a question and a comment. I think, firstly, so grateful to see, as a proud Ukrainian Canadian, really grateful to see friends and relatives from Ukraine on the screen and still in good spirits. It's really good to see you folks. My comment is first that I have a dual reaction to the commentary I've seen on the stage thus far. One side of me is intrigued and excited by the innovations being described, and the other is concerned that we're talking about the level of financial architecture and administration. When I think back to the Marshall Plan, I was just looking up the numbers. After World War II, the United States gave the equivalent of $240 billion in 2023 dollars to Western Europe free of charge. That was a grant. And here we are talking about leveraging the seized assets of, in some cases, quite cruel and evil people to be leveraged in complicated ways with the contributions and participations of private sector players. That's not inherently a bad thing, but I would be curious to some of the panel's reaction to, are we getting a little too realpolitik with our belief of how much money we actually can spend? Because certainly in historical terms, we've spent vastly more in the past. But my question is directly, in terms of the idea of building back better, which I'm very much supportive of. I work in climate change, I want to see that. How do we be careful not to instill too heavy a hand as Western wealthy countries in demanding a certain style and expectation of building back better, which I do think is important. So thank you.
Great question. Really appreciate that. I think, how do we ensure as the capital flows to reconstruct Ukraine post-conflict that we don't have too heavy a hand in determining what those funds are used for. And I think, Louise, perhaps you could comment on this based on your slides. I think the community-based financing and the social finance tools and engaging impact investors, part of why it seems so useful is that it really empowers communities. But I'll go to you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So our expectation, based on examples from previous conflicts, is that a lot of the international funding will ultimately flow through government in Ukraine. So the procurement and the design of how that funding is spent will ultimately be driven by local government, national government, and determined by that. That doesn't mean it won't come with any strings attached. It is a reasonable expectation, I think, when funds flow through multilateral agencies like the World Bank or bilateral agencies like FCDO or USAID or Global Affairs Canada, that there will be some requirements around considerations, good practice for procurement, and potentially, I think, there will be some climate recommendations as well that come with that are probably actually okay. I think it's probably a good thing that some minimum level of environmental standards are applied to how the funding is used. I think, as you say, though, Ryan, one of the reasons that we're really pushing for community accountability to be included as a consideration is exactly that it can't just, in terms of what communities need and want, that can't be determined internationally. It can't even be determined nationally. It really needs to be located within the specifics of the communities in which the reconstruction is happening. And so having some of those checks and balances in place to ensure that needs assessment, aspirations are understood, and then an accountability for satisfaction and appropriateness of what is constructed feels really important to us. And I don't know whether Charlotte, I think, is online, may have something to say from a bilateral agency perspective.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm going to go to Lloyd next because he wanted to make a short comment, and then we're going to.
I just want to make one short comment. The last couple of weeks, I had discussions with people at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, as well as the others who are in direct contact with the governments of Ukraine. What they're really concerned about, amongst many concerns, is that the constant destruction of the power grid in Ukraine, with all the kind of requisite support it has, is really in danger of undermining morale, undermining the capacity of the country with a winter coming. In Canada, we have probably the world's best energy corporations in British Columbia and Manitoba, Quebec, Ontario, Newfoundland. I mean, we've got a high level of expertise on how to fix the grid, how to restore power, how to provide maintenance, all these things. We're not using it. We're not putting it on the table. So it's not just the money, it's also the capacity, the ability, the know-how. And we're sitting by, and I would think it would be a wonderful example of, which is very rare these days, of federal-provincial cooperation. They got their act together and said, let's do something about helping Ukraine restore its electrical grid.
Well, we certainly welcome federal-provincial cooperation. I can say that without any hesitation. Look, I know we have responded here from the Commonwealth and Development Office at the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, Charlotte Back, who is going to make a few comments and add perhaps to what Louise was saying. Charlotte, can I go to you?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. So working for the British Embassy in Kyiv and deploying overseas development assistance, it's really our responsibility to provide the best possible value for money, both for the British people, the British taxpayer, but also optimizing impact for the Ukrainian people. And so, as Louise mentioned, the UK has experience in outcome-based financing in other settings, including conflict settings, which we can draw on and potentially pilot in Ukraine to support social and economic recovery. And we've touched on physical infrastructure. It also struck us in the UK government that Ukraine is also facing a huge human capital challenge, and this is having an impact immediately on business continuity, as well as longer term impacting growth prospects. Now, employers and private sector in Ukraine are still active, are still willing to take part in efforts that will support immediate resilience, recovery, and reconstruction. And so, as Louise set out, setting these community accountability pilots, there's an opportunity to bring in Ukrainian employers, to bring in Ukrainian private sector to contribute through these outcomes-based financing models to what can be workplace adjustments to increase inclusion of vulnerable people. There's an increasing population of veterans, of people with disabilities. There's a need to reskill and upskill Ukrainian workers, including women, including people with disabilities. And we see a real opportunity to bring the private sector into that equation and give them an opportunity to test models and demonstrate cost effectiveness through building that evidence base. And if it works, then there will be payback. But we, through our grant money, should be supporting that testing and that piloting. And that's what we'll be taking forwards in Ukraine through this pilot work, and I look forward to working with others in testing that model. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And maybe just on behalf of the Government of Canada, I'll make just a brief comment here. We remain very open and welcome any of the efforts that come out of these discussions. I think there's a recognition that there will be multiple forms of capital at scales we haven't seen perhaps in many decades. And I think that, you know, I'm sure that the Europeans are going to do something fairly large. But I think, and Canada has been there all throughout every step of the way. But I think we need to, we really are open and willing to work, you know, and listen to what new tools can be deployed to help with Ukraine's recovery. So I think the ongoing conversation is important. I think there are things that can happen to engage philanthropic and private investors that may not need the federal government's endorsement. I think there's somehow in some of the discussions that are had, there seems to be an implicit assumption that that is always necessarily the case, and it may not always be the case. There may be things that can happen using community-based outcomes finance that can happen without the Government of Canada's support, that can demonstrate a model that we can then get on board and rally behind, which I think may actually be useful in feeling like we can unlock certain potential solutions rather than wait for a very challenging, wrought international political environment to all get on side. Which proves challenging, I'm sure. So I think this is very encouraging. I know we're out of time for this particular panel. It's just been very exciting to moderate. I want to take just a moment and thank all of our panelists. We've had quite the selection of panelists. Can we have a round of applause for the panelists, everyone? I really think this panel has stood out to me to be a bit different in kind than some of the other more domestic conversations we've been focused on. So I hope the audience has found it enjoyable and stimulating. I hope as well that if any of you are interested in getting involved in the future work that will happen through a working group on this that comes out of this, there is a QR code up on the screen here. If you want to scan that, you can quickly answer a very short survey and perhaps engage in the ongoing work that will flow from this discussion. So I hope you will take part and contribute your expertise and ideas and get engaged on this particularly important, obviously, topic. So thank you very much for all of your participation, your patience with some of the technology, which I thought worked pretty well considering how many people we had coming in. So I want to thank everybody who helped organize this session, and it was a pleasure to be here to moderate. So thank you very much.
Thank you.